Today I'll be reading, if I can, a few chapters out of Ajahn Geoff's Meditations. Meditations 3 and 8. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Boring. The voice that says, "This is boring. Why do we believe it so easily?" Lots of other voices come into the mind, and you can listen to them and not get involved. But the one that says, "This is boring," seems to sneak right into you, and you identify it with it immediately. So it's important that you learn not to do that and to be on your guard. Otherwise, it takes over. You sit for a while watching the breath, and a voice in the mind says, "This is boring, nothing's happening." You can go off and think about things you've thought about who knows how many times, and yet you find it, and yet not find it boring. You can think about food. How many flavors are there in food? Not that many, really. Sexual fantasies. Whatever your favorite fantasies may be, there are not that many variations in those fantasies. And yet we can go over them again and again and again and not find them boring. Then there's aging, illness, and death. By now we should really be bored with them, yet we keep coming back for more. But then when you sit down with the breath, which is your path away from this boring suffering that we've been going through all along, you find you very quickly get bored with that. There are basically two reasons for this. One is that you're not paying careful enough attention. There was an Ajahn in the forest tradition who once complained to Ajahn Lee, saying, "What is there to see? Where are you going to get any discernment out of watching the breath? It's nothing but in, out, that's all. What kind of discernment can you get from that?" Ajahn Lee replied, "Well, if that's all you see, then that's all there is." In other words, the problem is not with the breath, it's with the attitude you bring to it. After all, where did the Buddha find awakening? Right here at the breath. And his breath wasn't any different from ours. What was different was the attitude of interest and attention that he brought to it, because, of course, he wasn't watching just the breath. He was watching the mind relationship to the breath, seeing a lot of subtle movements going on in the mind. Those are the really interesting things. And everything you need to know for awakening is right here. It's just that your powers of observation are not subtle enough and all around enough. And if you can't even see the subtleties of the breath, there's no way you're going to see the subtleties of the mind. So start questioning your attitude toward the breath. What's going on when you breathe in? What's going on when you breathe out? How does the in-breath and the out-breath relate to the other breath energies in the body? There's a lot to explore here. If you find that there are pains in different parts of the body, this is an excellent time to see how the breath relates to pain. What kind of breathing aggravates the pain? What kind of breathing helps to alleviate the pain? What ways of perceiving the breath either aggravate or alleviate the pain? Or if you can find that there's a sense of ease, you can play with that. Can you spread it around? Can you spread it out to every pore? Can you keep it going? How long can you keep it going? If when you've kept it going for a while, the mind says, "Well, okay, enough of that," you have to say, why? Why is that enough? If it were really enough, you'd be awakened, but you haven't gained that yet. So try doing something new with the breath. There's nothing you're going to learn by just doing the same things over and over again, without trying any variations, without asking any questions. This is where insight comes from asking the right questions. Just as with science, new revolutions in science come from asking new questions. the kinds of questions that people prior to that time would just dismiss. For example, all the questions people started asking that led to chaos theory are things that people used to ignore. A dripping faucet, for example. Is there a pattern in the drips of a faucet? Most people just dismiss the question. Nobody ever learned anything from it. But then a group of physics students decided to ask, well, what if we made a graph? They started observing the dripping faucet and they began to see interesting patterns. Those patterns led to some important discoveries in chaos theory. So there are things going on all around you and inside you that you're not paying attention to. As a result, you don't learn from them. So when you find yourself feeling bored, ask yourself, is there some way I could pay closer attention? Is there something going on here that I'm not curious about or not learning how to question, taking too much for granted? Because that's a lot of what the problems in the meditation are, things that you just take for granted. They've got to be that way. Well, do they really have to be? If your normal pattern is that you're sitting here for an hour and it takes a good 30 minutes for the mind to gradually drift down, well, why? You know where you have to go. You know what you've got to do. Why does it require this long, gradual drift? Can't you get right to the point at the very beginning and see how long you can stay there? Part of the problem is that you've made up a narrative about how the meditation has to go. And whether it's a good or a bad narrative, you're comfortable with it. But it's a pretty boring narrative. So once you've got your spot, remember that. Or once you've found your spot, remember that. The next time you sit down, go right there. Don't waste any time. And see what happens around there. If you're afraid that you won't know what to do with all the extra time of stillness, ask yourself why you're afraid. When you probe into the matter, you'll learn some interesting things. So that's the first thing you want to look for when you find yourself listening to that voice that says, this is boring, and you're getting ready to believe it. It's usually a sign that you're not paying very careful attention. Fabrications are going on, perceptions are going on, all the aggregates are going on right here, and you're relating to them in your old ways. And as we all know, the old ways are the ones that cause you to suffer. There's ignorance there. There's something that you're not looking into, some question you're not asking. So try to cast around and see what that question might be. The question that will allow for some new ways of doing things as you stay here with the breath coming in and the breath going out. If you need some added motivation to stay here, you can drop the breath for a little while and go to the other recollections, the recollection of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, recollection of death, the fact that it could happen at any time. Whatever recollection you find gets you more motivated. Think about it for a while until you're ready to come back to the breath. And remind yourself, everything you're going to need is right here, simply that you haven't noticed it yet. As Ajahn Geoff says, it's like walking back and forth on a path. A path that you follow often is one you start to get to know really intimately. If you pay attention, you'll notice subtle differences in the path that you would have missed if you had followed the path only once or twice. Otherwise, if you don't pay attention, if you just go on automatic pilot, you're never going to see anything, no matter how many times you walk the path. But the advantages of staying with the breath is that there are also the movements of intention right here in the present moment, and those are the things you've really got to watch out for. That's the kamma in the meditation. All of the other factors that you need to understand, they're right here for you to observe again and again and again. If you let yourself get bored with them, you're never going to see their subtleties. You just tell yourself, okay, I've seen this before, I know this. Remind yourself, if you really knew these things, you'd be an arahant. You'd be free from suffering. So there's still something you don't know. That's the way of dealing with boredom. The other type of boredom is the one that comes over you when something is about to appear in the mind and you don't want to look at it. You're about to uncover something important, but a part of the mind wants to keep it hidden, so it puts you to sleep. This is why the Buddha has you fight drowsiness and not give it into it right away. Test it, probe it, challenge it. Change the way you breathe. Visualize the light right in front of you. Rub your limbs. If you have to, get up and walk around for a while. Do some walking meditation. See if that wakes you up. But don't give in to that old habit that says, well, if there's drowsiness, I might as well go to sleep right now. I must really need it. Or if I'm drowsy, this meditation isn't going to go well. I better stop. Sometimes something's about to come up in the mind. Sometimes something's about to come up, but the mind is hiding it from itself. So hold that thought in mind. I don't want to be afraid of whatever comes up, whatever the unattractive defilement might be. If I don't let myself see it, I'm never going to be able to get past it. The problem is that part of you is identifying with the defilement. All too often, we identify with all the wrong parts of the mind. This is why you identify with the boredom that's hiding something that's causing you to suffer. So you've got to remember, the things that you hold on to are causing you to suffer. However much you may like them, however much mileage you may get out of making them part of your internal narrative, you've got to remind yourself, if you ever want to get past the problem of suffering, you've got to be able to look at whatever comes up in the mind. So if there is a sense of drowsiness that comes with the boredom, take it as a warning sign. Something is being avoided in the mind. So those are the two primary things to look for when that voice comes up. This is boring. You have to ask, really? Well, let's stick with something that's boring for a while. We spent most of our lives running away from what's boring, complaining about what's boring. So turn around and face it. Look at it carefully. Is it really boring? If it's part of the breath, there's something interesting going on here that you're missing. What's really boring is the way that we keep giving in to our old defilements again and again and again, and suffering again and again and again. You've got to ask yourself, at what point will you have had enough? Nobody else can ask that question for you, so you've got to ask it yourself. Next chapter, but so maybe this is at the other spectrum of what we can experience. And this is Meditations 3, Mindstorms. There's a part of the mind that's just aware. No matter what else comes into the mind, greed, anger, delusion, despair, depression, regret, or fear, it's just part of the mind. There's also another part that's just aware of these things, but it tends to get blocked out with when strong emotions come in. Still, it's always there, like the hum of the refrigerator always there in the background. Or maybe a better analogy would be the hum of the Big Bang, the deep B flat that's still detectable from all directions all the time. One of the tricks of the meditation is learning how to get in touch with that part of the mind, not to regard it as something exotic, but to have it as the background state of the mind, the basis of your conscious awareness. This requires a shift of your center of gravity, because for the most part we tend to live in our emotions, in our creations, in the little worlds we create for ourselves. But as the Buddha pointed out, there's a lot of suffering in those worlds. They all require effort to keep them going. They have to feed off something. When the Buddha says that becoming is conditioned by clinging, the word clinging can also mean feeding or the act of taking sustenance. And the sustenance is the passion of desire, the desire that makes us create these worlds, that pulls us into these worlds and impels us to take them as far as they can go. There's always an act of feeding going on, and it's stressful. So you've got to learn how to get out of those little worlds that you've created for yourself. Otherwise, you can create huge emotional storms that can blow you away. People talk about sitting and meditating and being blown away to the point where they can't even sit anymore. But if you actually look at the wind from the outside, there's no physical wind blowing them off the seat. It's just that they let these emotional storms get blown up in the mind, and they put themselves in the storm, so that, of course, they're going to get blown around. What's important to remember is that there's always an awareness surrounding the storms. If you can place your center of gravity in that awareness, you don't get blown away. It's not that difficult to get out of the storms if you can observe them as they arise, as they're just beginning, but they're hard to extract yourself from if they're already full blown. So you need to learn how to change your center of gravity in advance and keep it changed. Otherwise, the secondary storms, the ones that blow in on the tail of the first storm, can catch you off guard. One of the problems is the impatience that blows up. One of the problems is the impatience that blows up as a separate storm. You get impatient. When are these storms going to go away? And then you place yourself in that second storm, the impatient storm, and that can blow you away as well. Or you can get swept up into a storm of boredom. A lot of these secondary storms are the ones that throw meditators off balance. So you have to watch out for them. Remember that there's a space around these storms as well. You have to learn how to watch those from the outside too. A great deal of the commentary going on in the mind is just this sort of thing. You pull yourself out of the storms, whirling around events from the past or future, but then you let yourself get caught up in storms of the present. When these things come up, regret or impatience or whatever, just watch them. They may seem awfully powerful and awfully real, but you can learn to question their reality. Remember that although there may be a reality to these things, it's a created reality, false, artificial. It's something you're creating right now. You may not even be aware of what you're doing. Back when I was younger, I used to like to write fiction. Basically, what a fiction writer does is to inhabit a little mental world, exploring what it feels like from inside. The more real you can make that world to yourself, the better the story when you write it down. What's uncanny about these worlds is that sometimes a character you create can surprise you. The more real the character becomes in your mind, the more it can start doing unexpected things. When that happens, you start thinking, maybe this character has its own reality, but it's actually a figment of your own imagination. The reason these characters can surprise you is the same reason that you get surprised by things coming up into the mind in normal world-creating thoughts. You're so oblivious to what you're doing that it can actually surprise you. That's when these thoughts begin to seem very real, to have an independent existence. What's happened, though, is that part of your mind creating them is behind a wall, separated from the part that's watching them. That's why they can take unexpected turns. This is why we have to get the mind really, really quiet, both so that we can get closer and closer to the part of the mind that simply observes, and to get clear about where these fabrications are coming from. When you can see that second part in operation, it offers no surprises. And when you get to the point where fabrications offer no surprises, you start getting disenchanted with them. You see them for all their artificiality. You can begin to pull yourself out of their worlds more and more consistently. So whatever storms come brewing up in the mind, remember, it's just an event in your awareness, and there's an awareness surrounding it, outside the storm. Learn how to give more weight to that awareness than to the storms. If you're going to identify with anything, and it's natural that we do identify with things along the path, learn how to identify with that very still awareness. It may not seem very intelligent, very creative, but it's your salvation. It's what you can hold on to that will keep you from getting blown away. How many times have you seen people who are very clever, very imaginative, very creative, and then something takes on an independent life in their minds, and they can actually end up killing themselves simply because of their thought creations. They find themselves pushed into all sorts of weird and self-destructive behavior simply because they can't let go of particular thought worlds in their minds. So for the survival of all that's good and worthwhile in your own mind, you've got to learn how to step out of these things, realizing that although that simple awareness may not seem interesting or clever, it's your real friend. And there's a wisdom in learning how to stay there and watch. Not to be impatient to get results, not to be impatient to see how things turn out. Learn how to be more stable in that watching, because that stability is what will allow you to see very subtle things, to see the tricks the mind plays on itself, the places where it pulls the curtain down or throws up walls to maintain its illusions. Your steady gaze is what's going to enable you to see through those illusions. In the early stages of meditation, that basic watcher, the observer, may seem as unstable and as fragile as any of the other worlds you might create. But as you get more and more used to placing your center of gravity here, you find that it's a lot easier to stay here than to keep creating those other worlds. This awareness, too, is a kind of world, and there will come a point where you have to take it apart. But in the meantime, this is the most stable world at your disposal. Over time, your center of gravity can begin to shift more and more in this direction. Once it's here, the qualities of stability and patience and endurance come a lot easier. You can come to value them more. Although they themselves may not seem all that surprising or entertaining, they do allow you to find out some very interesting things about the mind. In particular, you'll learn how to see through this process of creation. Where do these worlds come from? This is how the Buddha discovered dependent co-arising, by just watching very patiently, putting himself in a position where he didn't get blown away. It's like really good scholarship. Everyone wants to get in on the dialogue of common scholarly assumptions and show that, yes, they can engage in that dialogue as well. But the people who say, well, stop, wait a minute, these questions don't make sense. Something's wrong here. Those are the ones who bring a real advance in knowledge. When you step back to get out of a particular dialogue, you begin to see its underlying assumptions for what they are. The same thing goes on in the mind. There are little signals and signs the mind sends to itself, and you feel clever in catching their meaning. Yes, I understand that signal. I'll play along with that. And then you get sucked into the world of those signals and signs. But it takes real understanding not to get sucked in by the signals, to step out of the worlds that those signals create. Ajahn Geoff once said that one of his greatest insights in meditation was seeing how the mind liked to play make-believe with itself. You have these little internal signals and agreements. Well, this is this and that's that. And suddenly there's a whole world of becoming, just because you thought you were clever in interpreting and catching on to those signs. So sometimes it's good to play dumb, to say, I don't understand this doesn't make sense, and step back. That right there is a lot of the practice. And that's it.
Handamayang Dhammikataya Sadhu Karanda Dhammase
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Just one question, maybe not so related to this talk, but for example, like say somebody does have is in confusion, or they are. Is it always the case that, for example, like maybe perhaps their room is messy or their cabin is messy, and then it kind of like sets the precedent for the whole kind of.
It's oftentimes is a supporting factor. In the sense that so much of training the mind is also paying attention to the world around one, and and similarly, that by paying attention to the world around one, then one can create some order in one's mind. I mean, it's not absolute, but these tend to be supporting factors or supporting conditions. And one can use them, in the same way that one, paying just in the talk today, where one starts to question the assumption or the idea this is boring. Hey, wait a minute here. What's boring about it? And in the same way, when there's confusion and how to question that, and how to, because we tend to, whatever comes up in our mind, we tend to assume it's valid because it's come up in our mind, and then so that we're paying attention to how the things around us condition us, or reflecting on that, and then just learning how to pay attention to detail is a skill that we're start to we pay attention. That's why I say things like looking after our requisites, looking after upatat duties and things. You start paying attention to those kind of details. You develop a habit of mind that pays attention to detail, that pays attention to keeping things clean and neat and tidy. And that habit of mind starts to get transferred to our relationship to the mind itself. So they work together.
So it's not the other way around?
Well, I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, oftentimes in the sense that once one is say the mind enjoys paying attention, enjoys that, then it enjoys a sort of certain order around itself.
Yeah.
The author said at some point you have to take apart about awareness as well.
Yeah.
Does he mean take apart this sense of identity of a self with it?
Part of that, but then also the I mean, because there is that identification that we tend to. I mean, it's just how it works. I mean, we claim ownership over everything, and whatever little bit we can get, we'll take. So it's just sort of recognizing how that works, and then how do we, how are we able to return to, say, that awareness as a refuge, as opposed to a possession or a skill that we kind of claim ownership of, or we compare ourselves to others with. It's more like, oh, this is a place of letting go, of relinquishing.
One point in that same talk, talking about like the storms of mind and awareness that sees them or knows them, is that kind of understanding or model for, like in that context, it was like dealing with like really strong emotions and like storms of thinking or whatever. But would you say that that's applicable to any sort of, I mean, I guess everything in the mind seems like it is that nature, but is that kind of a general kind of a way we can look at anything that arises, any kind of afflictive state?
Well, or it doesn't even have to be afflictive in the sense of, I mean, it even when your mind becomes, say, really peaceful and bright and radiant, and you start realizing, oh, well, there's this capacity to actually know that. It's not a possession. So that's a place of letting go.
So like even like when the weather's really good in the mind, like grabbing onto that or getting involved in that.
Yeah. You know, I really got this meditation nailed now. You know? that can be just as afflictive in a certain sense as well, or disappointing. It sets oneself up for the separation from the loved.
That's what I've always appreciated about Ajahn Geoff's teachings is just that constant encouragement to, just investigate and reflect and that it's an active process.
Yeah.
Not just a passive, observation kind of process.
A passive, waiting for Godot, waiting for enlightenment to dawn upon one. I just sit here long enough. So I think, no, you have to be engaged with it, and that's he's really skilled at emphasizing that.
So when there is some settling, calming, quietening in the mind, I notice like a kind of vibration in the for me in the chest area that has an edge to it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. Skillful way to work with that.
Well, I think just the recognizing it, acknowledging it, holding it, being aware and alert of it, and because one can either, it's the habits of mind start to kick in, and sort of seeing how those habits start to kick in. Either the sense of, this is why does it never become peaceful? I thought it was going to be more peaceful than this. I thought, there's a whole, dialogues that sort of go along with, even as the mind becomes peaceful, where it's either comparing or feeling short-changed, or it starts to create an inner dialogue of what one's gained. All of the or the doubt is something wrong with this? So that all of those are they're whatever we're experiencing is an opportunity to see how the mind responds, so that we can understand it and not be entangled in the way that the reactivity of the mind.
Just real quickly, one word that you just used struck me as being really important. And you say how, the word how, like asking the question, how is this, rather than what is this? Rings a bell of importance.
Yeah. Because then that's a different way of framing it, because then we're engaging in it. We're putting a label on it and easily.
Analyzing.
Yeah.
When he was talking about like making our own kind of worlds, thought worlds or whatever, and he mentioned a connection between that and or that being kind of a presentation or portrayal of dependent origination, and talked about how like clinging and becoming, and then kind of clinging also being synonymous with, I guess, like feeding on nutriment.
Mm-hmm.
And those kind of brought me to the, those teachings in the canon where the Buddha talks about the nutriments that we grasp on in creating a sense of self and things like that. I was just wondering if you could say some more about that process and the four nutriments, and that's basically what we create a self out of, and that's what the process is talking about.
Yes, and it's helpful to, that the teachings that the Buddha gave on the nutriment are really they're really important to understand that process of what the nutriment is, and then also what is understood when we understand the nutriment. That nutriment of sense pleasure, and what? Because then when we understand that, then we understand the cords of sensual desire that hold us to objects, the different understanding of around feeling, say, where one starts understanding feeling, then how that then allows us to step back from the whole sort of mind-body complex. So those are these seeing how it's not just sort of looking at the object of what we're feeding on, but then where is it feeding from, and how to untangle that web. So those are really really important teachings to be sort of reflecting on and bringing up, because that's one of the, there's a I'm not even sure if it's, I think it's canonical. There's it's sort of like, I know in Thailand it's part of the Samanera Cittapalo, and part of the Nattam tree is what is the one? It's in Kudika. Oh, okay, yeah. So then it's the one thing that is nutriment. That's the one thing that is always kind of the one thing to be seen, understood, worked with is nutriment. And then it goes through different. It's like almost, I think in Thailand they use it almost like a catechism, but it's that when talking about the one thing, it's nutriment that gets pride of place.
Another thing I appreciate about Ajahn Geoff's way of teaching, and something that, I don't know, you kind of implied when you were answering Samanera Cittapalo's question about how, for me it becomes more and more important to pay attention to the kind of the wide spectrum of influences in our meditation, because presumably we're meditating, a lot, but every time we sit down, we're working with different conditions externally, different conditions internally.
Yeah.
And then that importance that he places on developing a skill, and actually sati is recollection, remembering what happened earlier in the day, paying really close, like you're saying, paying really close attention to the details of the conditions, and then starting to sort of, in a way, scientifically put together an understanding of all the different conditions that come together to create our experience, and just doing that over and over and over again, and paying close attention to those things.
Yeah.
It's been very, very difficult, of course, but very good learning opportunity.
One more question for. So it seems like there's a lot of basically just seems like just in the world, maybe modern world, it just seems that there's a lot of, how would you say, kind of just a lot of people who are miserable, you know?
A lot of people are what?
Who are miserable.
Oh yeah.
Even though they have what they want, they live in a nice home or whatever. So what is it?
That's exactly why the Buddha pointed to dukkha as a tool for investigation, because you think on a materialistic level, the world is just full of all the material comforts and conveniences that hasn't made people happy. Really, I mean, they're convenient, but it's really, or in the sense of, people still live in just as much fear as they did living in some sort of some little village surrounded by jungle. I mean, it's the fear is still there. These are primal qualities in the human condition, and desire, fear, competition, and the modern world doesn't. I mean, it ameliorates some aspects, but it doesn't really change the underlying tendencies to. It's like there's this classification of dhammas where the Buddha speaks of the biases or and akati. It's where literally it means the leaning of the mind. So the bias of desire, the bias of aversion, the bias of delusion, the bias of fear, chandakati, dosakati, mohakati, bhayakati. Those are the things that those are the things that made human beings' minds lean and be out of balance in the Buddha's time, and the same thing that does that in the modern. So it's like this teaching or this training is an opportunity to come back and understand what is it that keeps my mind and my heart out of balance and biased in some way.